Is there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere, sometime, along an indefinable line between the reasonable and highly unlikely? Join us twice a month on a journey into the improbable.
Today's story, episode 247, Island 3, read by Mitchell 2, opening and closing theme by Matthew Erdman. Somewhere and sometime, you might discover there is no such thing as a simple choice. Seda had to look away from the cargo bay portal as the sun glinted off the metallic end of the giant cylinder, floating serenely against a backdrop of stars. We are on final approach to Island 3, a pre-recorded announcement advised. All cargo must now be strapped in. Any damage caused by loose servitors will be the responsibility of their respective owners. Seda looked around the cabin, noticing that at least a few of her fellow cargo hadn't heeded the message and were still floating around, playing in the microgravity. "Hey, you should join us," a young Earther in a gray jumpsuit encouraged. "You know, have fun while you still can." He floated by, motioning for her to unbelt her straps. "The docking isn't dangerous. They just want you locked down for unloading and processing. It makes it easier for them." "I think I'll stay strapped in," Seda said, shaking her head at the kid's pointless act of defiance. She couldn't afford to draw attention to herself. She needed to slip through customs unnoticed, as just any other human servitor fortunate enough to have won the opportunity to escape the squalid conditions on the surface below to work as an indentured laborer on the island. The interior suddenly lurched as the reaction control system fired to position the shuttle for docking. The youth in the gray jumpsuit collided with a crate of machinery. Unlike the floating kid, it was tied to the deck and followed the shuttle several meters to the left, hitting the youth, who was unwittingly demonstrating one of the fundamental laws of inertia. It opened a gash in his forehead when they collided. Doing his best to staunch the bleeding with one hand, the kid, no longer joking around, pushed himself back into his assigned seat and strapped in. After a second, violent jolt, everyone else had belted up, a few now nursing bruises. Seda knew the shuttle would aim for the exact center of the end cap, where the docking station protruded out into space, and could feel it begin to spin to match the rotation of the giant cylinders. Island 3, as the two cylinders had come to be known, was the largest object ever constructed in space. It had taken a generation to assemble in Earth orbit from metals mined from the moon and several asteroids and organics and volatiles ripped from the Earth. Its maintenance had since become a major industry, consuming significant resources. The project had drained the bank accounts of 6 trillionaires who, late in the last century, publicly declared life on Earth needed to become extraplanetary. Although everyone knew that wasn't the true reason for its construction. The two counter-rotating cylinders, each at 20 kilometers in length and 8 in diameter, formed the brightest object in the evening sky. Seda could remember looking up at it at night, wondering what life would be like there, wondering if the stories about its wealth and beauty were true. In a few minutes, she would find out, and a few minutes after that, if all went to plan, Island 3 would start to pay for all the resources it had stolen from the world below. The pops of the reaction control system suddenly stopped. Then there was a bump, which jerked Seda hard against her restraints. This was followed by a series of clanks, and finally, several electric motors whined as a flexible seal was pushed into place over one of the station's airlocks. Unloading will commence, starting with row 1, the recording announced. Human servitors turn left on exit and proceed to customs. Other cargo turn right and proceed to processing. They floated out in single file. Gray jumpsuit kid glided ahead of Seda, now sporting a blood-stained handkerchief around his head. Once inside the dock, a wire mesh gate in a tunnel-like corridor blocked the way. The human cargo was buzzed through, one at a time, until it was Gray Jumpsuit's turn. The kid presented his papers, was scanned, and waved into a waiting area where a tall, thin islander was engaged in an argument with one of the customs officers. "It's damaged goods," Seda heard the islander complain, pointing at Gray Jumpsuit. She presented her papers, then was pushed into a scanning device. Despite knowing this was part of the process, her heart began to race. She closed her eyes and used the techniques she had been taught to quell her nerves. The last thing she wanted was an elevated heart rate or high blood pressure to single her out for closer inspection. They assured her the scan would find nothing, but knowing that and experiencing the process were two different things. Taking a deep breath, she concentrated on relaxing and let the machine do its work. But it felt like it was taking forever. Had they found something? She couldn't afford to get caught here. She needed to get to the habitat cylinder. Seda was considering what to do when the end of the scanner suddenly slid open. "Hey, are you taking a nap in there?" A surly customs agent snarled and grabbed her feet, pulling her out. She glided until her progress was blocked by another wire mesh barrier. An agent, floating by it, handed back her papers, then opened a hatch in the wall and pushed her through. Seda found herself floating in a large holding area with the other workers from her shuttle. Small robots propelled by fans were busy herding them to numbered alcoves along the walls. She felt one butt up against her back and start pushing her toward alcove 39. Once the little machine was sure she was on target, it veered away to shepherd another new arrival. Seda instinctively grabbed onto a handle in the alcove and waited. After what seemed like an hour, she felt tired and allowed herself to drift off. Sometime later, Seda didn't know how long she had been asleep. She was nudged awake by a bot which was guiding her to the exit hatch. She was the last worker in the room. The exit hatch slid open just before she collided with it, and she floated through it into a pickup zone which was empty except for a shipping agent and a young boy who appeared to be around 12 years old, dressed in a brightly colored jacket and shorts. "Here's your shipment," the agent informed the boy. "Sign here." She pointed a data pad at him so it could scan his face, then glanced at the result and called out, 39, your employer is ready for you." The bot shoved Seda toward the boy, who nodded at her, then pushed off the wall with practiced ease and floated down a passageway. She glided behind until the corridor ended at a glass elevator, which looked out onto the interior of the habitat. Seda bumped up against the glass wall and was immediately overwhelmed by vertigo. "If you haven't seen it from this perspective before, it can be a bit disorienting," the boy explained, noticing Seda pull back from the glass. He pressed a hand on a control panel, and the elevator began to move. "We should strap in," he advised, pointing to benches on what Seda had mistaken for the ceiling. Her orientation suddenly shifted, making her stomach complain. "What's your name, 39? The boy asked, then introduced himself. "I'm Darius. I own your contract." "Seda," Seda replied, suddenly feeling ill. "Well, Seda, first time in microgravity most Earthers get sick," Darius stated. "As we descend to the habitat level, the spin gravity will become apparent. Then you won't feel so bad." Darius looked like a prepubescent boy, but Seda knew looks meant nothing on the island. The intel she had been given claimed the boy man was in fact 60. He, like all islanders, had chosen to slow his physical aging. Although outlawed on the surface, life extension was considered a right of citizenship on the habitat. Darius seemed to know what Seda was thinking. "Yes, I'm a lot older than you," he confirmed. He would also know how tall she was, her genetic lineage, formal education, what little of it there was these days, and complete medical history. It was all in the dossier Darius would have received from the Lottery Commission. Suddenly, she realized she had been unconsciously fingering the ring on her baby finger and stopped, hoping Darius hadn't noticed. "Nervous?" he asked, watching her like a cat. "Yes, a bit," she admitted, but not for the reasons you might think, she told herself. She knew she should really act now that she was inside, but she found herself fascinated with the place and decided she could deliver the package any time and still complete her mission. There had never been a directive about when, just that it had to happen inside the cylinder. Seda looked away and stared out of the elevator to the habitat stretching off into the distance. The massive cylinder was formed by 6 parallel strips, 3 where the islanders lived and 3 transparent to allow reflected sunlight in from the giant mirrors surrounding the habitat. As it rotated, the light grew and waned on each of the land strips, replicating day and night. Soft-looking white clouds drifted on the carefully controlled air currents in the center. It was oddly serene and peaceful, making it even more impressive than she had imagined. But that would soon change. After all, it was what she was here to do. "I know you're much older than you appear, sir, and that is common here," Seda said without turning back. She also knew the real reason the island had been built was to avoid terrestrial laws and taxes, especially laws around human modification. Island 3 had almost immediately declared its independence as soon as it was completed. Out of reach of the world's governments, the select few rich enough to pay for citizenship were basically allowed to do anything they wanted, and they had, ordering up so many genetic modifications that the islanders had truly become a different species. They told Seda this when they had injected her with the package. Islanders were a different species. The package would only affect the islanders. It was perfectly safe for everyone else, they had claimed. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Darius said, mistaking Seda's distracted look for awe. "The biosphere is based on what used to be a subtropical climate," he explained, "before those latitudes were abandoned because of the extreme weather. Our grandparents' generation brought up as much of that ecosystem as they could before it disappeared. Now, it thrives here, perfectly preserved. There's no heavy industry allowed in the habitat. That's on the surface or in orbital factories when it makes financial sense. Not that many Earthers get to experience how the Earth used to be in the pre-collapse days. There are still billions of people down there, all crowded into the mid and northern latitudes, and only 2,000 support positions up here. That means your chances of getting one is nearing statistical insignificance. So, you should feel lucky to have beaten the odds." Seda nodded distractedly. "Take your time. There's no rush," she told herself. Yet, there was a stubborn part of her mind that was angered by this boy man's sense of entitlement and wanted to put an end to his smugness right now. Instead, she turned to Darius and asked, "How did you make your money?" Surprise, followed by annoyance, flashed across Darius's face before he regained his composure. She thought he was going to reprimand her and cursed herself for shooting her mouth off. She knew better than to do that. However, Darius did something unexpected. He answered. No one has ever asked that before. Earthers usually ask about their calorie quota or working conditions or where they'll be bunking. But sure, why not? My family made their fortune in fashion, then diversified into media and food production. The latter made us the most after the collapse and still does. We're one of the top 100 corporations. And all those profits end up here, Seda thought, looking down at the neatly arranged mansions nestled in the lush forests and gardens below. They had just been dots in an ocean of green when they had started to descend. Now, as they got closer, their individual designs were becoming apparent, and down was beginning to feel like down. You'll be working for my family, Darius explained, as a domestic. I thought everyone had robots up here, Seda asked. If we used them for everything, there'd be very few positions for you dirt grubs. Darius smiled insincerely. We're doing our best to help the situation down there by employing as much manual labor as we can. I'm personally using about a dozen of you. Robots make better domestics, he sighed. But then we must all make sacrifices to do our part to make things better on the surface. Once you pay off your transport and cover your room and board, you are free to send what's left of your pay right back down the gravity well. Right, Seda grunted. An electric car, driven by an Earther servitor, picked them up at the station, then deposited them halfway down the habitat at a sprawling estate on a hill, which offered stunning views of the cylinder's interior. Seda couldn't help but look up, and immediately became dizzy and disoriented again by the sight of the other habitation strips curving above her. For a moment, she felt as if she were hanging from the ceiling, looking down at the ground, 8 kilometers away. Some Earthers never get used to it, Darius said, so I'd recommend not looking up. But right now, I need to introduce you to the house manager. Island authorities should really make them sign for new labor instead of the owners, Darius complained, then led her to a side door and let her into a small room, telling her to stay there. The room, although underfurnished, was still better appointed than anything Seda had experienced on the surface, where critical building materials were scarce. The islanders claimed it was too expensive to drop badly needed metals down the gravity well, but when it came to organics and volatiles, they had no qualms about literally digging up the ground and launching it up to the island. Allowing a handful of Earthers to live in a clean environment for a few months is scant compensation, Seda growled to herself. The house manager turned out to be a machine, which immediately assigned Seda to a chambermaid position and put her to work. Hi! The young girl's voice made Seda jump. She had been stripping a bed in one of the mansion's many rooms. Seda turned around to find a girl who looked maybe 8 years old watching her. Hello, she said guardedly, looking for clues to the girl's true age. You're the new maid, the girl stated rather than asked. I'm Persephone. It's a name from Greek mythology, she added proudly. Persephone was the daughter of Zeus and the queen of the harvest. My friends just call me Percy. I'm Seda, Seda said, rolling her eyes after turning away to continue stuffing the bedclothes into a laundry bag attached to her housekeeping cart. Darius, Persephone, did everyone on the island use ancient Greek names, she wondered? Is that how you see yourself, on the same level as a powerful Greek god? She muttered to herself, but instead said, It's a nice name. Let's play hooky and go for a walk to the lookout, Percy suggested. But the house manager will, Seda began to protest. I'll square it with that stodgy machine, Percy assured her. It's programmed to do what I say. I'll just have it assign someone else, or tell it to do the work itself. It doesn't have a choice. Seda fingered her ring, reminding herself of the power she was carrying. Percy led her up a winding trail from the back of the sprawling estate, through a manicured forest, tended by Earthers, to a lookout point above the buildings. From there, they could see the habitat strips wrap up and around them. Seda had to admit, it was an awe-inspiring sight. I like to come up here, Percy explained. It's one of the few places, other than the elevators, where you can see the whole habitat. I feel energized looking at it. This was not an 8-year-old talking, Seda suspected. The background she had been given on Darius had not mentioned Percy. But whatever the girl was, she found herself liking her. Percy was disarmingly charming and sincere. Finding someone likable here was the one thing Seda had not been prepared for. She looked out at the interior of the cylinder and once again thought it was the most astounding thing she had ever experienced. Would it remain the same once the changes she would unleash took hold, she wondered. And, for the first time, she felt her determination waver. Tell me about life on the surface, Percy suddenly asked. Is it as bad as the media claim? There are still moments of beauty, Seda found herself explaining. Especially north of the 60th parallel, around Hudson Bay where I live. After the collapse of the Greenland ice fields and the North Atlantic current, well, everything changed so fast. Everything moved to the higher latitudes. So it's where all the industry is, and there are days when it's hard to see the sun if the winds are in the wrong direction. We have masks for those days, but they're not perfect. My family has 2 rooms in a company building and jobs in a processing plant. I suppose we're better off than most. Then I won the lottery and now I'm here. It was the story she had been given to tell. If anyone dug deeper into it, she wasn't sure it would hold up. But then Islanders were not that interested in life on the surface. And without enhancements, you live, 50 to 60 years? Percy stated, looking out across the crystal clear air of the habitat. And that's something I don't understand. Why do Earthers refuse to use gene therapies that could make you less susceptible to environmental conditions and extend your life expectancy? Why is industrial production banned here? Seda countered, then quickly switched subjects. Sunrise over Hudson Bay at the spring equinox. It's beautiful. The colors are something you don't get here. I'd like to see that, Percy admitted. Seda had intended to add that pollutants were the source of the colors, but didn't. Over the next few weeks, Seda came to the realization she wasn't capable of hating the girl, and even came to consider her a friend of sorts. Maybe that was why she hadn't delivered the package yet, but she wasn't really sure where the hesitation was coming from. She just somehow felt it wasn't entirely right to carry out the plan she had been sent up to the island to complete. One day, when 4 customs agents unexpectedly arrived at the estate, Darius seemed genuinely surprised. We're here for the Earther, Seda could hear one of them announce from the front entry. She had been helping Percy prune her favorite potted plants on the 2nd floor balcony, and instantly knew this was not good. Her first instinct was to run, but she realized there was nowhere to go in an enclosed cylinder. Would being caught really change anything? She asked herself. The answer was obvious. No. She heard heavy footfalls on the stairs and steadied herself for what was to come. Percy stopped what she had been doing and gave her a knowing smile and calmly watched as the large, genetically enhanced Islanders grabbed her, shoved a hood over her head, then carried her off. When a bot finally removed the hood, Seda found herself in a room lit by dim red lights. She was seated in its center, and the floor under her chair was transparent, So when she looked down, she could see the night side of the Earth hundreds of kilometers below. She quickly looked up, an irrational fear of heights gripping her. She was in orbit, inside a space station. She wasn't going to fall, she reminded herself. But instinct was insisting otherwise. Seda suspected they had placed her there to make her feel vulnerable. As her eyes began to adjust to the dim light, she could make out 3 figures, each standing against one of the room's walls. She imagined there was a 4th behind her and tried to turn to confirm her suspicion, but she discovered she was strapped to the chair. "What is your real name?" one of the shadowy figures demanded. "Seda," she responded. "But that can't be," another said. "Your DNA doesn't match the Seda on the cargo manifest for your flight up. It's very close. Close enough to almost get by the initial customs inspection." "And that's very interesting," the 3rd person added. "Genetic alteration at the level you've gone through was banned on the surface long before the collapse." "My name is Seda. I won a placement in the lottery. Check the records," she insisted. "We did, and that part is true," the 2nd figure said. "Seda did win, but you're not that Seda. You've been genetically altered to look like her. We've confirmed that using a hair sample Persephone provided us." Seda felt like a knife had been pushed through her heart. She had trusted Percy and been lulled into letting her guard down around the girl. "Don't look so surprised," the first shadow said. "Persephone might physically look 8 years old, but she has the intellect of an adult. She also has enhanced sensitivity. There was no way you could hide anything from her. When we noted the anomalies in your custom scan, we assigned her to that family to keep an eye on you. She wouldn't have been in any intel you were given." "Normally, we'd just open the airlock you were sitting on and let physics do the rest." The unseen person behind her spoke for the first time. "But we're fascinated that some group on the surface was so desperate to get you up here, they resorted to using the genetic technology they are so fearful of. The question is why? Tell us why, and we might put you on the next shuttle down. It's better than becoming a human shooting star." Seda felt the small needle-like burr on the inside of the ring on her baby finger. All she had to do was use it to break her skin, and she would complete her part of the plan. The rest would happen automatically. Just a single drop of her blood, and a virus hidden in her platelets would be released into the air. It had been tailored to render the islanders sterile and reset them back onto a normal aging process. After that, the islanders would die out in a generation, and there was no way to reverse it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Seda insisted stubbornly. "Help us," another one of the shadowy figures offered. "Just tell us the name of the group and the location of the lab which modified you, and you can stay on as a domestic." Silence took over the room as Seda struggled with her conflicting emotions. When the mission was described to her, it seemed so easy, but now that she was here, she discovered she didn't want to be responsible for ending life on the station. "She's not going to answer," the person behind her stated coldly. "We're wasting our time. We just need a blood sample. It will allow us to determine the technology used, and the place, and the people involved." The bot which had taken her hood off drifted out from the shadows. Its manipulators wrapped around a needle and several small vials. "Stop!" Seda yelled. "You don't understand the stakes!" The robot ignored her. She tried to struggle away from the machine as it reached out and roughly grabbed her arm. She saw the needle go in and winced. The stupid thing had missed the vein. It withdrew the needle to try again. As it did, a single drop of blood oozed from the wound, and began to trickle down her arm. Part of Seda wanted to laugh and tell them what their hubris had just unleashed. Instead, she let relief wash over her now that the decision had been taken from her. Saddened, she shed a single tear for the end of Island 3. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. To get other great APN podcasts, head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com, where you'll find The Read Along, a mini book club for your ears. Join Scott and Anita Bourgeois as they go on a weekly chapter-by-chapter journey. This episode of Makeshift Stories is brought to you by Pod Power. With Pod Power, our sponsors are making it possible for us to amplify the voices of Albertans and Alberta podcasters. This episode, Edmonton Community Foundation is helping us give a Pod Power shout-out to Book Women. Book Women is a podcast about editing, publishing, and writing Indigenous stories. 3 Métis librarians, representing nations from across the homeland, aim to inspire Indigenous peoples to share their stories in whatever form that they enjoy. Guests include Indigenous storytellers from diverse mediums like podcasting, burlesque, books, comics, social media, films, music, and everything in between. You can listen and find out more at bookwomenpodcast.ca. This episode of Makeshift Stories is also brought to you by First Connect Credit Union.
Welcome to Super Typical Megabank. How can we disappoint you today?
Hi, I'd like to open an account.
May I pressure you into considering a pro-disadvantage, high-regret, impersonal, everyday inconvenient savings plan with added compounded confusion at no additional discount or apology? It's one of our top disappointers.
I feel so...
Disappointed?
Yeah.
Another unsatisfied customer. Next!
If your bank makes you feel like this, it's time you talk to us. Connect First Credit Union. Bank on a brighter future.
Makeshift Stories is released around the beginning and middle of the month. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchell Tu. Opening and closing themes were composed and recorded by Matthew Erdman. Audio production and editing by Makeshift Studios. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by getting your friends to subscribe or follow wherever they listen to audio. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution no derivative license, which means you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.